Thank you, comrade supporters. Any new friends joining us for our regular CPGB-ML seminar? This month we're talking about a couple of really important and interesting topics for the workers' movement in Britain and internationally: Burkina Faso and Yemen. And these two countries have been, for many years, a focus point for anti-imperialism and proletarian internationalism. Burkina Faso obviously has, quite a revolutionary history. The name of the country is revolutionary. It was named Land of the Upright Man when they overthrew the old colonialist order and decided to stand up and assert their rights as an independent nation and embark on a socialist program of developing the country for the working class and peasantry of that country, which was then obviously overthrown by imperialist intrigue. But I'm not going to go too much into that because Eleanor's going to talk on Burkina Faso today, and then we have Harpreet's going to speak on Yemen, who has been standing up on behalf of the Palestinian resistance very nobly for the past couple of years. Absolutely. And it's actually seen off two of the biggest imperialist powers, the imperialist bogeymen, the US Navy, the British Navy. All the imperialist navies have not been able to stop Yemen from closing the Red Sea from traffic that was supporting the Zionist states, from imperialist traffic essentially, as well as striking directly at Israel as it embarks on its genocide of Palestinian people. And we'll also, after those talks, see if we have some space to talk about the recent Israel-Iran conflict, which has been many decades in the making and is another important focus of the anti-imperialist struggle in the world today. And it's important for us to be able to link these struggles. They seem distant, they seem far away. We're all carrying on our normal lives. We're going to work, we're going to the park, we're trying to spend time with friends and family. And for us communists, we're trying to convince the rest of the working class that these things are intrinsically linked with the degradation of the lives of the working class in this country. We see that the Labour Party, who are supposedly the party of the working class, although we know that's not true. We know they've always been an imperialist party, but they've successfully convinced a lot of the working class in Britain that they represent the working class here. But we've seen them continue with the policies of austerity. We've seen them continue with the imperialist policies of war, supporting the Israeli genocide. The Labour Party is a criminal imperialist party. And life here for working people is getting worse, while Labour are also making life worse for millions, if not billions, of people around the world by continuing these imperialist policies. And in essence, what this means is that our ruling class, whether they're represented by the Labour Party, by the Tory Party, by maybe Reform, by the next elections, whatever representatives of the ruling class are in office in Britain, the policies remain the same. And that is to inflict more pain, more suffering on the working class here through cuts to social services, to institutions like the NHS, as well as war abroad, because they desperately need war to prop up their failing economic system. As the crises of imperialism deepen and deepen and get worse and worse, have things gotten better since the 2008 financial crisis? That was meant to be the big one, where they gave billions and billions and billions to the banks to bail them out. Wasn't that supposed to make life better for us? Wasn't the wealth meant to trickle down? Well, it hasn't. The rich have gotten richer, again during the lockdowns, and that was disguising yet another financial crisis, where massive amounts of wealth from the poorest in our countries have gone to the richest people. And as the system grinds to a halt, as we're less able to purchase things, even things that we need for survival, basics like food, electricity, the water bills going up massively, even the essentials for life are getting more expensive and less accessible for people as more and more people are being made jobless. More and more people are being made homeless. More and more people aren't getting the healthcare they need on the NHS because it's being privatised. People can't afford to travel. All of these things are linked with the struggle in Burkina Faso, the struggle in Yemen, the struggle in Palestine, the struggle of Russia, Iran and China to stand up against the imperialist order in the West. They are standing up against our same class enemies. Same people who are making life worse for us and then telling us that we need to go die to defend this system that isn't doing anything for us. So it's vitally important that we bring these messages to the working class, because without doing that, we run the risk of allowing the social chauvinists and others to dictate the message that, well, they may be our class enemies, the Labour Party, the Tory Party, the British ruling class, but isn't Iran worse? Don't they hate women and gay people in Iran? Isn't Russia worse? Isn't Putin mad and evil? Aren't the Chinese worse? What are they up to? They're going to take over the world. We want to remain in control of the world, don't we? Well, in reality, we don't. The workers of Britain don't have that in common with our ruling class. The ruling class are the ruling class. They're the ones that benefit from this system. And we have everything to benefit from overthrowing it and defending these countries in whatever way we can, supporting these countries in whatever way we can, in terms of anti-imperialism. So I'm going to pass over now to Eleanor, who's going to tell us a bit about the struggle in Burkina Faso, the amazing work that they've been doing since they've taken control of their country from the imperialists.
Thank you very much. Is it all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about the history of Burkina Faso, not in great depth, but just give you a bit of context, how the military junta that is ruling today came to power, and what are the reasons that forced Ibrahim Traoré to make his coup d'etat in September 2022 and lead the country today. So a wave of revolution swept through West Africa at the beginning of this decade. It started in Mali in 2021, then Burkina Faso and Niger followed and broke free from French imperialism, and also inspired Senegal and Chad to also turn their back on the former colonial master. Anti-French sentiment has grown for years in the region after the military occupation of France in those countries. The French military bases were there in order to fight against terrorism, terrorism that became a huge problem in the region after the complete destruction of Libya by NATO forces led by France and the USA. So they create the problem and then present themselves as a solution. Even though there is a lot to say on the Sahel Alliance itself, my talk will focus on Burkina Faso and its leader Ibrahim Traoré, as he is the leading voice of this wave of independence and leans heavily on the legacy of Thomas Sankara, one of the most popular socialist leaders in the world. Sankara was killed by French imperialism for his sovereign and socialist policies. "We will not pay the debt" is one of Sankara's most famous speeches, but it's also considered as the speech that sealed his fate, as he was setting a very bad example for many other African countries that were and are still maintained underdeveloped due to the debt that they own to their former colonizer. So Ibrahim Traoré became the leader of Burkina Faso after a coup d'etat in September 2022, as I said. That was a coup d'etat that was massively supported by the population. Generally, in Africa, you see palace coup d'etat, which means that they're just changing leadership. A leader is in charge for too long, and someone gets tired of having to wait for their turn because election never happen. So and they do a coup d'etat. But this one was very popular and instigated by the population, by the desire of the population of change. So he's also very popular around the world and is an inspiration for many. Since he has come to power, his government has made a priority to pull the Burkinabe people out of poverty and cut dependence on foreign aid. He has also kicked out Western powers' military bases from his country. So due to all of this, he is seen by Washington and Paris as a number one threat. He has been the target of many assassination attempts. There is also a lot of fantasy about him online, a lot of AI-produced videos, and a lot of the numbers of assassination attempts are very speculative. But we can trust that he has been giving nightmare to imperialism and that they're actively trying their best to take him down by using puppet states like Ivory Coast and Nigeria. So France, as a former colonial power and an imperialist power, does not tolerate any disruption in his neo-colonial system put in place after the so-called independence of the 60s. France, contrary to the UK, practice a more direct form of governance over its former colonies, which means that they put a puppet leader in charge of the country and surround him by advisors that work directly for the French secret services. All the entourage of the France former colonies president are made of French secret service people. So they hold key role in the military and the civil administration, economy, and every important administration of a country. So it's a policy of direct tutelage, also known as France-Afrique. I think you might have heard of it. That's the name of the system. The leaders of those countries are highly infantilized and cannot make any decision without France approval. Most of them spend their time in France, actually, more than in their own countries, because life is better there. Burkina Faso had many of those presidents, Yamoego, Lamizana, and Compaoré, all put French interest first and foremost. Thomas Sankara, inspired by Marxist revolutionary ideas, was the only one that put the interest of the Burkinabe people first. Under his 4 years of governance, he changed the name of the country, as Dan was saying, from Upper Volta, of a colonial name, to Burkina Faso, which means the country of upright or honest men. He traveled across the country, listening to the stories of people and engaging with them on a possible solution to the many problems facing the nation. He launched ambitious reforms emphasizing self-reliance and social justice, massive vaccination and literacy campaign, tree planting project to combat desertification, and initiative to advance women's rights. Sankara's administration also required officials, including himself, to open their finance to public scrutiny and cut luxury perks for the elite. These radical policies won him the love and support of his people. Soon, his influence starts going beyond Burkina Faso. The country became known across Africa for the revolutionary leadership of Sankara. At the international front, he gave powerful speeches that resonate with other young Africans in search of honest and committed leaders for their own countries. He was not afraid to criticize the colonial power and challenge their policy that have kept Africa poor. I think if you've listened to any Sankara speeches, he's very straightforward and has a very direct style, and it doesn't how do you say? Yeah, it doesn't back away from the truth, even if it might even if in the end that was cost him his life. This won him a lot of enemy, but also make him a notable figure on the global stage. One of the things that set Sankara apart from the other past leader of Burkina Faso was his refusal to accept foreign aid. He instead focused his attention on what he can control. His government spent heavily on agriculture, believing it was the cornerstone of Burkina Faso's development. He believed that the nation's economic future depended on its ability to feed itself and improve the livelihood of its population. This bet pays off. His agricultural revolution leads to a 75% increase in cereal production between 1983 and 1986, But it is on the international stage that Sankara really threatened former colonial powers. He was wary of foreign aid that come with string attached and constantly refused to seek assistance from the International Monetary Fund, fearing that its condition will undermine his revolutionary goals. Sankara's foreign policy was also characterized by a strong commitment to Pan-Africanism. This stance earned Burkina Faso respect and new ally, but it also generated tensions with Western powers and conservative African governments, especially those with close ties to France. Some traditional authorities, middle-class professional and external powers, notably France and Ivory Coast, who felt threatened by Sankara's rhetoric and alignment with socialist states, will soon start plotting against him. So this was a quote from an essay named "The Man America Fear the Most." Traoré was born shortly after the assassination of Sankara by Blaise Compaoré, which was one of the closest collaborators of Sankara before to be bought off by French imperialism. He grew up under the very long and corrupted years of the Compaoré regime. After his assassination of Sankara, Compaoré was quick to reverse all the gain of the Sankara era and went back to business as usual with French imperialism. He brought back the old political order and comprador elite. His government started cracking down on dissent, and political rivals were arrested and eliminated. He quickly made a rapprochement with the IMF to bring back the country under the debt shackles. IMF, which Sankara spent all of his ruling years fighting against. He changed the constitution and organized elections that he won easily, having suppressed all opposition. Under his rule, life became more and more difficult for the Burkinabe people. Fast forward, in 2009, Ibrahim Traoré started his military career and enlisted in Burkina Faso army. He graduated as a second lieutenant around 2012 and received specialized training. During those years, a lot of unrest and uprising will shake Burkina Faso to contest the corrupt regime of Compaoré. So the way Compaoré ruled over Burkina Faso is basically the model all of the other leaders of French ex-colonies rule. So they get into power by a coup or they're directly installed by France, and then they change the constitution and can be elected as many times as they can or as they want without being contested. When in 2011, a high schooler named Justin Zongo died in custody, the riot against police brutality spread to the army, and soldiers mutinied in multiple barracks over unpaid housing allowance and low wages. Faced with protest from students and the military and civil societies, Compaoré was forced to make concessions to maintain himself in power. The government raised soldier pay, gave bonuses to civil servants, lowered food price, and promised justice for the killed student. But when in 2014, his ruling party amended the constitution to remove term limits so that he can run again, massive protests erupted. Thousands of civilians stormed the parliament to stop the vote. This time, Compaoré did not manage to save himself. His government quickly collapsed. He resigned in October 2014 and fled to Ivory Coast. So people were really, really tired of the reign of Compaoré, and yes, they just took the opportunity to get rid of him. So power, in the meantime, was assumed by different military chiefs. General Honoré Traoré, not related to Ibrahim Traoré, and Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Zida. None of those leaders offered a real change to the Burkinabe people. Captain Traoré, Ibrahim Traoré, so he has been having his career in the army and earning grades, joined the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali as part of Burkina Faso contingent and get involved in the fight against Islamic militants across the border. He was at the front line in the fight against terrorism. He served in northern Mali, and in 2018, he was among the soldiers honored for their courage during major rebel attacks in the Timbuktu region. After that, he returned home and took part in a counter-insurgency operation against terrorist groups acting in Burkina Faso. He saw action in hotspots like Djibo and participated in the 2019 Otapuanu offensive, a large-scale operation aimed at flushing out militants in the eastern part of the country. By 2020, Ibrahim Traoré had achieved the rank of captain at the age of 32. However, along with his promotion came growing frustration. His country was quickly falling apart before his very eyes, and there was little he could do about it. So after the military transition, in 2015, Burkina Faso elected Roch-Marc Kaboré, a former collaborator of Compaoré, as president. At the same time, the Islamic attack on the countries were intensifying everywhere, and a lot of army forces were losing their life, fueling the anger of the population. The Kaboré government quickly lost public confidence and showed itself incapable of protecting the population from the increasing terrorist attacks. The army was undersupplied and outgunned by the mercenary terrorists and had access to weapons stolen from Libya and the quiet backing and financial support of Western imperialism. So later it was revealed that actually Blaise Compaoré had signed agreements with the terrorists not to attack his country when he was in charge of the country, and as soon as he was demoted, those terrorist forces were unleashed on Burkina Faso to make it seem like Compaoré was the only one that could manage the country peacefully. So in January 2022, the country witnessed a new coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damida, ousting Kaboré. Captain Traoré was a part of the patriotic movement for safeguard of restoration that backed the coup. Damida, like Kaboré, did not manage to stop the terrorist threat, and more soldiers were dying on the front line. Damida also, like Kaboré, was a former close collaborator of Compaoré and went as far as inviting Compaoré, exiled in Ivory Coast and condemned by the Burkina Faso justice for the murder of Thomas Sankara, back to Burkina Faso to ask him advices on how to deal with terrorism. It became very clear that the influence of Blaise Compaoré and the France-Afrique system was still looming over the country. Traoré, who served on the battlefield against terrorism, felt like Damida wasn't the man needed to solve the country's problem. On the 30th of September 2022, he launched a second coup that was swift and bloodless. He was elected president of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration Council on October 2nd, 2022, and became Burkina Faso transitional president 1 week later at the age of 34, making him one of the youngest leaders in the world. Ibrahim Traoré is actually not the president of Burkina Faso because he has not been elected as such. He's a transitional president, so he's waiting for the country to completely get rid of terrorist threats before to organize proper election. Since he has been put in charge of the country as a transitional president, Traoré has been a strong voice against imperialism and corruption, denouncing Western meddling in the region and calling the terrorist attacks plaguing the country imperialist attacks. He has made strong moves that echoes Thomas Sankara actions, like refusing to give himself a higher military grade or renouncing his presidential salary. Fighting against the security threat the country was facing was his #1 priority. A nationwide campaign was launched to recruit civilian volunteers, and his government's goal was to defeat the insurgency outrightly rather than negotiate. He publicly vowed to reconquer every inch of territory occupied by rebel militants and stated there will be no talks with jihadist fundamentalist groups until they were militarily weakened to a point where they could not dictate terms. He also made a strong alliance with Russia that has included the deployment of a Russian paramilitary brigade. So his military is being advised by Russia at the moment in order to fight against those terrorist threats. In 2023, with the leader of Mali and Niger country, which suffer from the same terrorist problem, they created the Sahel Alliance that established a joint military force to strengthen military coordination to combat terrorism. Economically, it has made a priority the fight against mining fraud, the redefinition of operating contracts, increased support for subsistence farming and local industrialization. His cabinet approved the construction of the country's first state-run gold refinery to process gold domestically rather than exporting all their gold abroad. So despite being the 15th producer of gold, they didn't have any mine refinery before President Traoré. It has set up a state-owned mining company requiring foreign firms to give it a 15% stake in their local operation and to transfer skill to Burkinabe people. It started the process of nationalizing gold mines owned by foreign companies. It has diversified economic partnership, particularly with emerging countries, on the basis of equality and mutual respect. It has rehabilitated road and energy infrastructure, stimulates local entrepreneurship, notably through support fund for young people and women. It has implemented a policy of economic resilience to external shock, particularly in time of sanction and internal crisis. The economic measures taken by the Sahel Alliance on a regional level are also important to underline. So the alliance has withdrawn from the neo-colonial institution Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, and their monetary system known as franc CFA, and they're working on a single currency. On a social level, Captain Traoré policy have fostered unprecedented patriotic mobilization and social cohesion, particularly around territorial defense and national reconstruction, promoting inter-community reconciliation and the return of internally displaced people. In collaboration with local authority, it has launched basic social services such as health, education, and drinking water. The government has also placed youth at the heart of the national project to build a new Burkina based on hard work, honor, and integrity, as the name of Burkina Faso say, as well as supporting cultural, artistic, and educational initiatives that foster the deep rootedness of Burkinabe values. So, because of all of that, as I said at the beginning, is heavily targeted by assassination attempt, and the most recent was in April this year, when I think it was on the 28th of April, they managed to stop an assassination attempt on this person, and that's spread a wave of solidarity protest for the Burkinabe leader. So those protests were organized in many cities around the world, like London, Accra, Montego Bay, and Jamaica. So many of us were at the London one to show support, and it has been amazing to see the support that the countries from the Sahel state, but also Burkina Faso, are getting around the world. In the street of London, we have a leaflet that we go on stall with that is very popular. People recognize the picture of Ibrahim Traoré, not only black people, but people from every color, and they take the leaflet because they generally support the country and what it stands for. So it shows that people are seeing through the lies of their imperialist ruler and are seeing, and we are seeing the union of the oppressed people of the world against imperialism. So yeah, that was.
Well done, Ellie. That was a fantastically interesting and useful talk. I think there's been lots of facts in there that perhaps haven't realised or thought about, so it's really nicely to set them all out like that and what they're doing economically and socially. I think the economic aspect is huge, and there is a division within the international communist movement at the moment, and Eleanor was representing the World Anti-Imperialist Platform over the last week in The Hague while NATO were having their summit where they've dictated to all the NATO members that they have to spend up to 5% of their GDP directly and indirectly on military spending. And it shows the desperation, it shows the need, the drive to war from the imperialist states that's getting ever more urgent. And we've seen the news articles talking about how the experts and Keir Starmer and everyone else wants us to be ready for war. Well, why are they saying that? Because they're losing their economic grip on countries like Burkina Faso. They're losing the prospect of getting their hands on countries like Iran. It was a couple of months ago, Iran found deposits of antimony, a very valuable rare earth metal. And so 10% of the world's known reserves of antimony are in Iran, not to mention all the oil and other natural resources in such a big country. And it's been that way since World War II, and all of the colonies became ex-colonies, but mostly in name only. They've been controlled economically by the imperialists. And it's what Traoré and any other leader that generally wants to divorce themselves from the imperialist system and use the resources of their country for the benefit of their own people to develop their own nations comes into conflict with the imperialist system. And that also necessarily moves them towards socialist and communist ideas. Because if you look at the leadership of every successful anti-imperialist struggle over the past century, it's been led by socialists and communists. So it necessarily brings them into contact with those ideas, with those revolutionaries. But that's precisely what the Sahel states are doing that upsets the imperialists so much. They're insisting that skills are transferred to their own workers. So they learn how to do things for themselves. They're also insisting that industries be developed there, because that's the system of exploitation. In Europe, everything's been developed to a significant extent. There's not much more to exploit in terms of natural resources, and the cost of living is much higher. But what European capital and American capital is able to do is export that capital to other countries, like in Africa, South America, across Asia. They export that capital in order to set up companies to exploit natural resources and cheap labour. And they don't want any of these countries to actually build anything themselves, do anything themselves. They want to exploit the resources, take them for themselves, and take all the profits, and leave these countries completely dependent on the West, and have a complete economic dependence, and leaves them completely vulnerable to any kind of manipulation, and leaves them languishing in a state of underdevelopment, where they're having to talk about we need clean water. I mean, it's unimaginable in Western European imperialist countries to say that clean water is a problem, although it seems to be becoming a problem. It's unimaginable here to think, oh, we don't have access to clean water. But that's the reality for all of these countries which hold the majority of the world's wealth, the majority of the world's land masses, the majority of the world's population are struggling with malnutrition, dirty water, disease, lack of development and infrastructure, precisely because the West is keeping them trapped in this situation. It's precisely standing up to the imperialist countries and depriving them of this source of easy loot and cheap labour that is causing the economic crises and the panic of our rulers, because the less they're able to exploit these countries, the weaker our ruling class gets. And that's the real reason they're so keen to go after Iran now. It's not just the natural resources, it's the link with China and BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. So only recently, the first freight train arrived in the, I think it's the Afshin dry port outside of Tehran, because China's built a railroad going from China, a port on the east coast of China, all the way to Tehran, making it completely independent and self-sufficient and not needing to use tankers and ships to go around the Strait of Hormuz or go through the Red Sea or in the Suez Canal. It can now bypass that completely and is not restricted to anything that leaves it vulnerable to disruptions of shipping that the imperialists might want to try and impose on them. And it's precisely those economic links, the development of these countries, that concern our imperialists and why they want to go to war with them. Not for your benefit, but for their benefit. And speaking of shipping, Harpreet's going to talk to us about what's been happening in Yemen, the revolutionary movement there, and what that means for the region.
Afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to jump straight into it because I have probably too many notes to get through and probably not much time. So I'm just going to, in the next half hour, give an overview of basically where the Ansar Allah movement comes from. So first of all, Ansar Allah is actually the correct term for what most of us probably know as the Houthi rebels or the Houthi movement. It's not so much that the term Houthi is derogatory or anything. It just comes from the name of the founder of the movement. But I just prefer to use the correct terminology. So I'm just going to essentially talk about where it comes from, its origins, its ideology, and the history of it and where it's going. Because we've all seen the news about the ship blockade and we've been amazed by it, but probably very few of us actually know where they came from. So I think we need to start by talking a little bit about the theology. Obviously, we're Marxists, we're materialists, but I do think it's important to understand the theological aspect of how these people, how their ideology was formed, because for them, certainly it's a very crucial part of their identity. So the Ansar Allah movement originates from the Zaydi branch of Shia Islam. Comrades are probably aware that Islam is split into Sunnis and Shias. Probably about 85% of the Muslim world is Sunni. The remaining 15-20% is Shia. The reason why they split was back when the Prophet Muhammad died, the Sunnis were those who believed that his succession was essentially open for the community to choose whoever they thought was fit, whilst the Shias believed that the succession to the Prophet Muhammad was predestined by God and that there was a chain of imams that came after him who couldn't be deviated from. And the Shias quickly became the minority, and this essentially breaks into a question that I've seen quite a lot on social media, which is a lot of people tend to ask, why is it that Palestine is a majority Sunni nation, overwhelmingly Sunni, but all the countries and organizations that are fighting for Palestine all seem to be Shia, whilst the Sunni countries don't seem to be doing much? A lot of people ask this. And part of the theological reason why I think this is the case is because of that minority nature of Shia Islam in the early days of Islam. It developed a lot more sort of resistance. It imbibed a lot of the concept of resisting tyrannical governments in the name of justice sort of ideology, while Sunni Islam became much more quickly co-opted into the state and became much more of a God commands you to obey the ruler sort of religion. And this reached a head round about 680 AD when the third Imam of the Shia was murdered by the majority Sunni Caliph, and this was the point where the Shia ideology really permanently embraced this sort of I don't want to say cult of martyrdom because it sounds a bit derogatory, but sort of embracing the concept of sacrificing, yes, resistance and sacrificing one's life for the cause to a much greater extent than Sunnis believe. And the Zaydi Shias are essentially a minority within a minority. The vast majority of Shias in the world are 12 Shias. They're the Shias that rule Iran, Iraq, the Shia minorities in Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Lebanon. They're all 12ers. They're called 12ers because they believe in 12 imams. But the Zaydis were a group that broke off from the 12ers around about the 5th imam. And the reason why they broke off, essentially, was because they believed that even the 12th imam was too pacifist. And they believed that the imam has to be someone who rises up against the tyrannical ruler of his time. Otherwise, he's not the legitimate imam. And that's why the Zaydi Shias broke off from the 12 Shias. And if you're hopefully still following me, the Zaydi Shias, they settled in what is now the northern part of Yemen. And that remains today the only region of the world where they form a very significant minority. I think to this day they are about 40% of Yemen's population, overwhelmingly concentrated in the northern regions of the country. So, ironically, even though the Zaydis actually have more of a emphasis on resistance compared with the 12ers, they're actually considered to be theologically closer to Sunnis. So, if you've got Sunnis and then 12 Shias, the Zaydi Shias are actually seen as sort of in the middle theologically, and historically, like hardline Sunni chauvinists, they would regard the 12ers as non-Muslim, but they would say the Zaydis are okay. And I'm going to come back to that because that's changed recently. But so historically, Yemen was one country. And I'm going to refer a lot about the northern part and the southern parts of Yemen. I'm going to try and avoid referring too much to North and South Yemen because I don't want to encourage the idea that it's two separate countries, which is becoming quite a popular idea promoted by imperialism. Historically, it's always been one country, but there's always been cultural differences between the northern regions and southern regions. So the northern regions of Yemen, I don't know if anyone wants to look at a map of Yemen on their phone just to sort of get where I'm coming from, but the northern part of Yemen is the northwestern region of the country, the capital Sana'a, most of the Red Sea coast. It's where the vast majority of the population live. And the southern portions of Yemen is the south coast, the port city of Aden, the vast central and eastern desert areas, which is a very large landmass, but not many people live there. So the northern part of Yemen is the part where Ansar Allah historically comes from. It's geographically very rugged and difficult terrain, and that helps the Zaydis as a minority within a minority to be able to settle there and remain largely unbothered for centuries. The southern portion of Yemen got seized by the British Empire in the early 19th century and became the Aden Crown Colony, which lasted through to the 1960s. But the northern part of Yemen remained nominally under Ottoman control until 1918, when it became the independent Kingdom of Yemen. Now, the Kingdom of Yemen lasted from 1918 through to 1962. And during that time, it became very well known for being a country ruled by a feudal regime that tried very, very hard to keep the country in a medieval feudal state, whilst the rest of the world was moving into capitalism, imperialism was stretching its tentacles, whilst Yemen tried very hard to just keep the country completely isolated. They say that the Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din was, they say that he never even saw the coast of his own country, and there's only one existing photo of him, which is a photo where he's just in the distance, and they had to take it without his knowledge because he wouldn't allow any photos of him, because that's how anti-technology he was. But as comrades can probably guess, that policy did not last too long, because eventually the discontent of the bourgeoisie built up, and Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din was assassinated in 1948. His son Ahmed came to power. They thought he was going to be a reformer. Turned out he wasn't. He lasted about 10-15 years. He died in 1962. And his son, Imam Muhammad al-Badr, was crowned. This was the point where the straw broke the camel's back, so to speak. This was the era of Nasserism, of Arab nationalism. We'd seen the Arab nationalist military officers take power in Egypt, in Iraq, overthrowing weak kings that had been installed by British imperialism. And now military officers in Yemen in 1962, specifically in northern Yemen, they decided to overthrow the Imam and proclaim the Yemeni Arab Republic. However, they slightly miscalculated because unlike the kingdoms of Egypt and Iraq, which had been installed by Britain and were weak and had no real social basis, the kingdom of Yemen stretched back a good 1,000 years and had very deep roots amongst the conservative Zaydi masses. And so the Imam al-Badr, he was quite easily able to flee into the mountains and build up an army. And when the Saudis, backed by US, UK and Israel, all decided that it was in their interest to prevent another Arab nationalist government from emerging in the region, they decided to arm the Imam al-Badr. This resulted in the North Yemen civil war. The Egyptians got involved on the side of the Arab Nationalist Republic with help from the USSR. The Saudis, US, UK, Israelis, as I mentioned, became the main supporters of the royalists. And it's worth noting that the same Zaydi tribal elements that were the bedrock of the royalists during that civil war in the 60s, they, decades later, became the same elements that became the bedrock for Ansar Allah. And I think this is an example that really shows the importance of understanding the conditions of a country, not just assuming that things are static before one can judge movements and adopt a correct policy. The Republic won the war in 1970. The Saudis and the West gave up. Imam al-Badr left the country for exile, never to return. Whilst that was going on, the southern portion of Yemen had actually launched its own liberation war. The Aden Crown Colony came to an end in 1967, and it became a Marxist-Leninist state in 1969. Became the only Marxist-Leninist state in the Arab world. I'm sure that comrades would really like to hear the details about that, but unfortunately I can't really talk about it too much because I genuinely don't know too much about it. It's a real enigma, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, but it's definitely something that I want to research more. But in any case, Ansar Allah's roots did not really have anything to do with the Marxist-Leninists in the south. They came from the other end of the country. So I'm going to focus more on the north of Yemen. So the Yemeni Arab Republic, which is North Yemen, goes through a series of presidents in the 1970s. Each one was overthrown in a coup after a couple of years. Eventually in 1978, Ali Abdullah Saleh seized power, and he held on power for the next 33 years, using a mixture of bribery, repression, just playing off the different tribes against each other, and through all that time serving as a faithful lackey of US imperialism. And round about this time, 1970s, 1980s, with the oil boom in the Gulf, a lot of Yemeni workers started going to the Gulf to work on the oil fields. And this is where the Saudis, no doubt with encouragement from Western imperialism, decided to make an active move to try and convert many of these Yemenis who are either Zaydi Shia or moderate Sunni, to convert them to the Saudi ideology of Salafi Wahhabism. And I think this is a really important point to understand, because Salafi Wahhabism has a reputation for being, it equals ISIS, which equals death to America. But actually, historically, Salafi Wahhabism has always been an ideology that's been promoted by imperialism, and it's benefited imperialism. In particular, for example, in Yemen, the godfather of the Wahhabi movement in Yemen, Muqbil bin Hadi al-Wadi'i, which comrades who don't know Arabic will be forgiven for not knowing how to pronounce that name. But he was well known for his beliefs that southern Yemen was actually better off under British colonialism because it stopped godless socialists from coming to power. And he also believed that, and this is a key Salafi Wahhabi belief actually, that the obedience to the ruler is absolutely a god. It's a right imposed by God, and even if the ruler is corrupt, even if the ruler is a criminal, you have to obey him. And the best you can do is just sit and pray that God gives you a better ruler. And Salafi Wahhabism emphasizes hostility towards other Muslims and minority faiths, very strict, overly strict interpretation of a Sharia law that tends to encourage an atheist backlash that ends up being exploited by the West. And they're generally indifferent to the threat of foreign colonialism. And you see even the so-called jihadist Salafis, they might have thrown away the unquestioning obedience to the ruler, but they're still generally obsessed with sectarianism, the extreme Sharia, then they're always easily manipulated by imperialism as a result. And all these values are completely in contrast to the Zaydi Shia values of standing up to unjust rulers, tolerance towards other faiths, and resistance to colonialism. And this naturally led to the Zaydis coming together and forming their own movement to try and push back against this foreign-sponsored promotion of Wahhabism in their country. They formed the Al-Haq Party to promote Zaydi culture. And this party entered the parliament in the early 90s, which is when North and South Yemen also reunified. The south of Yemen actually attempted to resecede again in 1994. It didn't last long because the Saleh regime quickly took the opportunity to crush that rebellion brutally, using the Salafis as their main mercenaries. The Al-Haq Party, whilst they didn't support the secession, the resecession of the South, they opposed the war, and they argued that it was a brother war and we shouldn't be shedding the blood of our own people like this, which was indeed a brave position to take. However, the Al-Haq Party was dominated by relatively cautious elders who focused on promoting Zaydi culture and pushing back against Wahhabism without really going beyond that. There was a lot of younger, more firebrand members of the party who saw the real enemy behind Wahhabism, America and Israel, and they wanted to take a much more openly anti-imperialist line. And this more radical line quickly became exemplified by Sayyid Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi, who became the founder of the Houthi movement, Ansar Allah. So Sayyid Hussein al-Houthi went around preaching in the villages of northern Yemen, organizing youth groups. He built clinics, schools, hospitals, did charity works. He served in parliament briefly, and all the time he was constantly putting forward the idea that the main enemy of the Muslim and Arab peoples is America and Israel, imperialism and colonialism. He used Islamic and Quranic rhetoric to call people towards an objective revolutionary goal, national liberation of Yemen and the wider Muslim world from imperialism and Zionist control. And this is why it's important to note the importance of judging a movement's revolutionary potential by objective rather than arbitrary criteria. So it's not about what sounds nice to us and what hurts our feelings. It's about what is objectively weakening imperialism and which is objectively helping it. And this is why I think it's important to address, in particular, the claim that's often thrown at Ansar Allah about that they supposedly hate the Jews, for example. Supporters of Zionism and imperialism, they like to spread this idea that, oh, well, look, these people, they say so-and-so thing against Jews. Well, you know who else didn't like Jews? The Nazis, therefore they're Nazis. And this is a completely anti-dialectical argument that acts as if history is static. Because even amongst some socialists, there's a tendency encouraged by imperialism to treat anti-Jewish prejudice as a uniquely evil crime that's worse than all other prejudices because of what the crimes the Nazis committed. And to be clear, and I'm only saying this for the online viewers because I think everyone in the room already knows this, we're completely against anti-Jewish prejudice and anti-Jewish racism. It's as wrong and reprehensible an idea today as it was 100 years ago. However, 100 years ago, the objective situation internationally was that the main reactionary racist ideology being promoted amongst workers and serving the interests of imperialism, 100 years ago, that main ideology was anti-Semitism. Today, that main ideology is the racist ideology of Zionism. 100 years ago, it was the racist ideology of anti-Semitism that was being used to justify genocide. Today, it's the racist ideology of Zionism that's being used to justify genocide. And in that sense, the racist ideology of Zionism is a much greater threat than anti-Semitism. 100 years ago, 100 years ago, imperialism was promoting anti-Semitic ideology everywhere because it suited their agenda. And those promoting those arguments were the most banal dupes and tools of imperialism, just repeating what they heard from the imperialist media. This is not the case today. Today, imperialism aggressively scaremongers about the danger of anti-Semitism, not because the system really cares about Jewish people's security, but because it needs to justify the existence of the Zionist settler colony, which it needs to keep in place in order to continue to destabilize and dominate over West Asia, the region with by far the largest oil reserves on the planet, if you put all the countries together, geographically. If any group today can be compared to the anti-Semites of 100 years ago, if anything, it's the anti-Islam crusaders, the Le Pens, the Tommy Robinsons, the AFDs, as fear-mongering about Muslim immigration now arguably is the primary racist discourse of the bourgeoisie. And I would argue that those few minority who do still promote anti-Semitic theories about the world, of course they're not suddenly right. Their ideas are still wrong, they're still misguided. But they can't be equated to the anti-Semites of 100 years ago because irrespective of their ideas being wrong and misguided, the fact remains they've broken out of the propaganda straitjacket of imperialism. They're adopting a position directly challenging the one promoted by imperialism, which arguably shows that these people have already developed the ability to think for themselves. And that means despite their current wrong and misguided ideas, those people have the potential to become revolutionary if only provided with the guidance they're looking for, that only a scientific understanding of imperialism can bring. And certainly, I think you can contrast that kind of right-wing person with the countless progressive, identity politics obsessed, pride flag waving, Ukraine flag waving socialists who, despite their loud claims to all things progressive, have never had a thought not sanctioned by imperialism ever enter their brains in their lives. So, returning to Sayyid Hussein al-Houthis' activism, when Sayyid al-Houthi stood for election in parliament, his opponents used to promise many extravagant things they knew they could not deliver. Hussein al-Houthi promised only one thing because he knew that he couldn't deliver much. He's only promised one thing, and I won't lie to you. And I think this is, the reason I'm saying this is I think the honesty and winning the trust of the people is really something, it's like the building block on which everything else needs to be built upon. And another thing that Sayyid Hussein al-Houthi was known for was when he was in parliament, he absolutely refused to sign off on loans from Western banks that the government was constantly taking out because he argued that ultimately people think that these loans will be picked up by the elites or they'll be picked up by the state or they'll be picked up by... So no, they'll only be picked up by the regular people. Only the regular people are going to suffer, whilst the elites are the ones who actually take the money. And this stance of his went down like a pile of poo with the government, essentially. And that alongside his refusal to support the war against the South. He ended up being forced out of Parliament around the turn of the century, and he focused on building up a rural activism base. He particularly focused on neglected rural areas. In his view, he noticed how Yemenis would flee the rural areas out of poverty and go to the cities. And once they reached the cities, their community bonds would break down, and they'd quickly become people who care about nothing other than money. He viewed this as a conspiracy, a conscious conspiracy by imperialism. Obviously, as Marxist-Leninists, through our study, we know the real reasons why this process goes on, which obviously I'm not going to go into here due to lack of time. But in any case, regardless of what various leftists and progressives might think, that they might think that Sayyid Hussein al-Houthis movement was a reactionary one, US imperialism certainly did not see al-Houthis' activism as a reactionary movement. They saw the threat such that they instigated the Yemeni regime to launch a violent crackdown on his peaceful movement, which ultimately led to him being murdered in the summer of 2004. Following the murder of Sayyid Hussein al-Houthi, the Ansar Allah movement took up arms and began an insurgency against the Saleh regime. A total of 6 wars were fought in the space of 7 years. Briefly, Sayyid Hussein's father, Sayyid Badr ad-Din, who was a very respected Zaydi elder, he briefly became the leader, but as he was quite an old man, he died within a couple of years. And then he was succeeded by Sayyid Hussein's younger brother, Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi, who I'm sure we all know very well. So towards the end of those series of 6 wars, Saudi Arabia became involved with bombing on the side of the Saleh regime. There was total imperialist media blackout of the conflict. And this carried on until Saleh was overthrown as part of the Arab Spring in 2011, one of only 3 Arab Spring countries to actually successfully overthrow a pro-Western dictator, and arguably the only one of the 3 that actually managed to consolidate that victory. Ansar Allah played little direct role in the uprising, but they took advantage of it. They took full advantage of it to take control of large parts of northern Yemen, particularly the major city of Sada. Saleh was replaced by his vice president, Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi, who was subsequently democratically elected the following year in a single candidate election. He attempted a more conciliatory policy towards Ansar Allah for a time. Sayyid Hussein's body was returned for a respectful burial, but along with other things. But Ansar Allah was not fooled. They continued to organise. They continued to hold massive rallies, in particular vibrant annual celebrations of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, which is a symbolic defiance of Salafi Wahhabi doctrine, which forbids celebrating that. They think it's heresy. But so the next enemy that the Ansar Allah had to face down was the Salafists, located in the town of Dammaj, which was a town located within the Zaydi heartland of northern Yemen. But because Muqbil ibn Hadi al-Wadi'i, who I mentioned earlier, built his madrasa, his Islamic school there in the 1980s, and within 30 years that town became a global stronghold of Salafi Wahhabism. So people from America and Indonesia and all different parts of the world would come there to study Salafi Wahhabism. And this, no doubt they weren't just studying literature, no doubt they were studying other things as well, because that town, around about 2012, 2013, erupted in essentially violent rebellion against Ansar Allah. And this didn't last long, because Ansar Allah managed to make short work of them, eventually demolishing that madrasa/terrorist factory in 2013. This was followed up by the Yemeni branch of Al-Qaeda declaring war on Ansar Allah, which kind of reveals the hypocrisy of the so-called anti-American stances of that organization, as those who have actually looked into the history of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda will know. They've always served the interests of imperialism and always will serve the interests of imperialism, as we can see from the fact they decided to declare war on Ansar Allah, the main group fighting imperialism in the region. And this links back to what I was saying earlier about Salafis historically being tolerant of Zaydis. They decided to essentially rewrite the theology and claim that, yes, well, historically we didn't like the 12 Shias and we liked the Zaydi Shias, but actually the Houthis, we've decided they actually follow a certain sect of Zaydis who are actually similar to the 12ers, so actually they're infidels as well now. So now we're going to kill the Houthis as well now. So which is just an example of basically of how religion is just rewritten to serve the interests of the powers of the day. This was followed up by the Al-Islah party declaring war on Ansar Allah, technically the Yemeni branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it effectively acted as the main Saudi agents within Yemen. Despite all these enemies declaring war on Ansar Allah easily managed to defeat them all with the support of the population of Yemen. And eventually matters reached a head in late 2014 when President Hadi tried to hike fuel prices to meet IMF bailout demands. Massive protests erupted. Ansar Allah quickly positioned itself at the head of the movement. They seized their chance at an October-style moment, and they marched on Sana'a in late 2014 with massive popular support. Large parts of the military defected to support the revolution. Initially, the two sides came to an uneasy agreement. President Hadi was allowed to continue to rule. Ansar Allah remained in the capital. Very little coverage of the Western media. 2014 was, I don't know if you remember, 2014 was quite a dark year. The neo-Nazis took over Ukraine, ISIS took over Iraq and Syria, Gaza was bombed. And this was a bright spot towards the end of 2014, the revolution in Yemen, arguably one of the only really mass popular revolutions of this century so far. As in revolutions that have brought to power an anti-imperialist vanguard movement. In early 2015, the truce broke down following proposals by the Hadi government of a new constitution that would balkanize Yemen into 6 federal regions. Ansar Allah rejected this. Hadi was placed under house arrest and forced to resign. Ansar Allah declares an end to the old regime, sets up a new Supreme Revolutionary Committee to run the country and begin the task of building a new state. and the revolution has won. As expected, condemnations began pouring in from imperialist governments and their institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, this organization, that organization. They all refused to recognize the new government. They all declared Hadi, who ran off to Aden in the south and later ran off to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. They all declared we recognize him as the legitimate president. They set up an internationally recognized government of stooges in exile. The General People's Congress, which was the former ruling party of Yemen for decades, right the way up until the revolution, is split right down the middle into a patriotic wing that joined Ansar Allah's new government and a comprador wing that fled to Saudi Arabia. Massive demonstrations in support of Ansar Allah. You've probably seen the pictures as far as the eye can see, crowds. Ansar Allah began to move to liberate the south of the country. They briefly reached as far as Aden on the south coast. Unfortunately, the people in the south regions were still in the thrall of tribalism and bourgeois separatism. They saw the movement as a foreign northern enemy. And so after a short period of fighting, Ansar Allah retreated from Aden, recognising the lack of support. They wisely decided to focus on consolidating their gains, knowing that an imperialist onslaught was coming. A lot of people, and a very large amount of people in the south of Yemen, remain nostalgic for the socialist era. But this is exploited to the hilt by the so-called Southern Movement separatists who stripped any mention of socialism and instead promoted bourgeois separatism and hate for the Houthi northerners. They mobilized heavily to fight Ansar Allah. They even called for imperialist military intervention to save them. They cited NATO humanitarian bombings of Yugoslavia as a precedent. And this indicates really the complete disappearance of any trace of Marxist-Leninist ideology, sadly, from the southern political scene. Whilst virtually all the liberal human rights activist heroes of the 2011 revolution, the heroes, they were spitting venom at Ansar Allah, rabidly opposing the revolution, joining forces with the southern bourgeois separatists, the Salafi Wahhabis, the Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, all to fight Ansar Allah. Ansar Allah found help from a surprising source, the former dictator Saleh, and is not a totally insignificant band of tribal loyalists. Now, Saleh has no principles. He simply wanted revenge on the people who forced him out of power. Ansar Allah was under no illusions about the true intentions of Saleh, but given their near total isolation at the time, they decided to agree on a temporary alliance of convenience with no illusions. Arab media begins a wholesale demonization of Ansar Allah to prepare the grounds for an invasion. They said they're proxies of Iran. They said they want to bring back the royalist regime. They said they're working with the dictator Saleh, even though the Saudis backed the dictator Saleh for decades. The Saudis backed the royalist regime for decades. So it's quite ironic. Eventually, in mid-2015, Operation Decisive Storm was launched. Gulf monarchies, pro-Western Arab states formed a military coalition led by Saudi Arabia, with the blessing of Israel and Western imperialism. Saudi planes, fueled, maintained, and directed by US and UK imperialism, began to carpet bomb Yemen. Over the next 3 years, a near total blockade on food and medicine and an indiscriminate terror bombing of civilian infrastructure leads to tens of thousands of deaths due to starvation and disease, in particular a massive death toll from cholera, resulting in tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of deaths, resulting from a coalition bombing of sewage treatment centres to deliberately cause a cholera outbreak. Of course, this was in the days when this sort of terror bombing was still seen as something shocking. This was before what we've seen in Gaza, where sadly we've almost become numb to it. But at the same time, ISIS appeared in Yemen for the first time. Surprise, surprise, they declared jihad, not against America, not against Saudi Arabia, but against Ansar Allah. And they did some devastating bombings that killed hundreds of Zaidi worshippers. Huge amounts of foreign mercenaries from Sudan were brought in. Notably, this meek submission to imperialism by President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, who historically had been opposed to American imperialism, but then submitted. This didn't save him from being overthrown and brought to The Hague. I believe he's currently in The Hague at the moment, in the ICC, so little sympathy there. Western media pays little attention to the war, and when they do report on it, they do so in such a way that all the articles seem to be identical copy-pastes, providing little info, using the same buzzwords and clunky phrases, assuming that that enough people don't really care about Yemen, that they're not going to notice that they're just copy-pasting the same article over and over again. The Trots and the Western leftists mostly ignored and dismissed the conflict. For example, I remember seeing the Socialist Party, they ran an article claiming that the Houthis fired on workers and therefore they're morally equatable to the Saudis who were carpet bombing the country, which kind of perfectly sums up the entire ethos of Trotskyism, really. A handful of left liberals attempt to raise awareness of the humanitarian tragedy and expose British and US complicity in the crimes. However, they invariably portray imperialism as merely helping the Saudis rather than being the ultimate directing force behind the war. And invariably, they also distance themselves from any sympathy with the resistance. And notably, a lot of these figures were also people like, for example, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, who was probably the leading figure opposing the Yemen war in Congress at the time. That is when he wasn't sharing stages with Swoboda and the other neo-Nazis in Ukraine in the Maidan. It was those sorts of people, unfortunately, who were leading the fight to support Yemen in Western parliaments. There was some opposition from the libertarian isolationist right, exemplified by people like the former Republican candidate Pat Buchanan, who argued correctly that Ansar Allah was the main enemy of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and therefore the US should support Ansar Allah to fight terrorism, which is a well-meaning argument, but of course misses the whole point of the phony war on terror. Despite the horrific violence against their people, their total isolation on the global stage, with the notable exception of Iran, and the odds stacked overwhelmingly against them, the Yemeni people under the brilliant leadership of Sayyid Abdullah Malik al-Houthi fought the invaders to a standstill and refused to surrender. North Yemen's rugged geography helped to protect it, in addition to solid public support and a remarkable lack of collaborators and informants, who all seemed to have fled to the southern regions at the start of the war. A level of societal loyalty to the resistance leadership comparable to Gaza, the West Bank, or even the DPRK, I'd argue. The only exception was in 2017, when the coalition forces decided to play the Saleh card. So Ali Abdullah Saleh's forces decided to break their alliance with Ansar Allah and launch an uprising in Sana'a on behalf of imperialism. This didn't last long. It was a total failure. Ansar Allah fighters swiftly captured and executed Saleh. They didn't mess around. His son Tariq fled to the south with a dwindling band of remaining loyalists and joined the pro-imperialist coalition, no longer a relevant force. The campaign against Yemen peaked in late 2019 when, I don't know if you remember, when Ansar Allah drones launched a spectacular attack on the Abqaiq Khurais oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, temporarily crippling Saudi oil production, sending shivers throughout global markets. Imperialism rushed to blame Iran for the attack, with no evidence other than, the impact looks like it came from the north side of the building. In reality, blaming Iran was a face-saving exercise because Western weapons manufacturing monopolies were deeply embarrassed that their expensive state-of-the-art AD systems had been outsmarted by these cheap, homemade Yemeni drones. It's a lot less embarrassing if we say a big state like Iran did it. If we say Yemen did it, no one's going to buy our stuff anymore. So mass terror bombing largely ceased following this strike, and limited blockade relief was allowed, bringing an end to the worst of the famine, which clearly shows that imperialism will never show mercy for its own sake. They will never show mercy for mercy's sake. They will only show mercy, they'll only allow respite if they're forced to out of fear of being given a bloody nose by an enemy powerful enough to hit back hard like Ansar Allah did. By this time, the motley coalition of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Southern separatists, Salafis, and the Hadi government was starting to fall apart. Only the Saudis and the UAE were still actively involved in the coalition campaign. All the other countries had given up and pulled out. And even the UAE force and the Saudi forces started fighting amongst themselves, even though they're meant to be allies. The Saudis primarily were backing the Hadi government in exile and various Salafi tribes. The UAE were focusing more on the southern separatists, who it turns out had a much stronger power base amongst the southern populations who as I mentioned, had a lot of nostalgia for the former People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. And this peaked in 2019 when the Southern separatists went to war against the Hadi government, a war within a war. They seized Aden, they seized most of the south coast, they seized the island of Socotra in the Indian Ocean, and this kind of made the Hadi government even more of a lame duck than before, because it lost control of virtually all the population centres, essentially only controlled desert. And in 2022, Hadi was forced into retirement. The internationally recognised legitimate president was forced into retirement by the Saudis, who installed a new puppet. No one noticed or cared. I'm not even sure what the name of the new guy was, and it doesn't really matter. But it's just interesting how all the fuss about the legitimate president, they didn't hold an election or anything. They just said, get out of the way, we don't need you anymore.
Is it Juan Guaido? I think he was looking for a new job.
It might be. So, despite the total isolation embargo on the Ansar Allah government, recognised only by Iran and I think Syria as well, the living standards of the Ansar Allah areas actually remained quite stable, whilst those in the coalition-held areas started free-falling. And this was in large part because the Yemeni central bank was effectively split into two. The coalition authorities in the south started mass money printing for their own purposes, which led to hyperinflation. But Ansar Allah very quickly acted and banned any of the new banknotes from entering their territory, which allowed the currency to stay stable and stop their people getting impoverished, like as has happened and is still happening in the southern regions. So Ansar Allah functions just a little bit now about the nature of Ansar Allah, how it governs the country. It functions somewhat like a vanguard movement. It provides leadership and spiritual guidance, but is happy to engage in governmental alliances with any patriotic party or individual who wants to see Yemen free of imperial control, like the patriotic portion of the former ruling General People's Congress, for example. Day-to-day governance is handled by the Supreme Political Council, whose leader is effectively the president of Yemen, although of course not recognised by most countries in the world. The first president was Saleh al-Samad, who was president, I think, from 2015 through to 2018, when he was murdered in a Saudi airstrike. He was succeeded by President Mahdi al-Mashat, who remains in the position to this day. However, the ultimate power in Yemen lies in the hands, undoubtedly, of Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the long-time leader of Ansar Allah, who holds no official position in the government, but his charisma and immense prestige earned through years of leading the struggle makes him the true de facto leader of the country. He acts primarily as a spiritual leader, I'd say roughly analogous to the role of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Iran. He doesn't appear in public since the revolution for obvious security reasons, but he very regularly gives speeches on the airwaves to give spiritual guidance and political speeches laying out Yemen's positions and ideology in minute detail. And I think this is actually a really important point, that Sayyid Abdul Malik, he has always made it a point of carefully explaining political and ideological issues to the population in clear formal Arabic, aimed at the wider Arab world as well as the domestic population, in a very frank and honest manner. I think probably the only other world leader, like leader of a country I can think of that springs to mind who does a similar thing is probably President Vladimir Putin in Russia. It's unthinkable to imagine Western politicians doing something like this, for whom speeches are just sound bites and PR. The bourgeoisie would never dream of going on a TV and clearly explaining their agenda to the public. Can you imagine it? But even during the worst of US-Israeli bombing, Sayyid Abdul Malik used to continue with his scheduled Ramadan lecture series. It didn't even interrupt it during the height of the bombing, which shows really the fearlessness of the Ansar Allah leadership. And now I'll get on to the part we've all been waiting for, the blockade they started on Israel in 2023. Effectively, Ansar Allah had already won the war in Yemen, but they were still largely ignored by Western media until autumn 2023, when the Gaza genocide began. Ansar Allah announced, in response to the Zionist refusal to allow food or medicine into Gaza, that they will impose a blockade on Israel by stopping all Israel-bound commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Their enemies laughed, even a lot of their friends probably laughed, but were shocked to the core when it turns out that Ansar Allah actually does have the capacity to put their money where their mouth is and actually impose an effective blockade. And for the first time, the mass media began to pay real attention to the Houthis, and obviously following the mass media as usual, the Western left began to finally notice Ansar Allah. Whilst imperialist talking heads were spitting venom on TV and in the newspapers, demanding military action to stop the Houthi-led attacks on commercial shipping, characterising it as piracy, the public in Western countries was so horrified at the ongoing final solution in Gaza, and the final solution, the Holocaust, basically, and Ansar Allah's clear and repeated statements, which the media did their best to obfuscate, that they're only targeting Israeli shipping, and only as long as Gaza is besieged and you can't get aid in. Let aid into Gaza, let them, stop the famine, stop them from starving, and we'll let your shipping back. That was the sole condition. And given that really simple message, the imperialist propaganda trying to demonize the Houthis largely fell flat, even amongst the Western publics. And we saw that the Eilat port in southern Israel ended up filing for bankruptcy because the commercial shipping essentially came to a stop. The Biden administration launched a military operation to intimidate Ansar Allah into ending the blockade. They began direct US airstrikes on Yemen for the first time. It failed, needless to say. Very few other countries involved themselves in it, probably because they knew it was going to fail. And the Gulf states in particular refused to have anything to do with it. I think the Saudis and the Emiratis were still suffering a bit of PTSD from the thrashing that they previously received. And indeed, Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi, during that previous proxy phase of the war, he used to openly challenge America, stop fighting us through proxies, come and fight us directly, I look forward to it. So essentially, he got his wish. The blockade continued right the way through to early 2025, and it only stopped because Israel briefly lifted the blockade on Gaza. It didn't stop, the blockade didn't stop the genocide on its own, but it did create a massive wave of global sympathy for Yemen, even amongst the Arab countries who, bear in mind, was subjected to non-stop anti-Yemen propaganda for years, probably comparable to the anti-Russia propaganda we get in this country. So, for the first time, supporting Ansar Allah becomes a popular position, and pro-Yemen flags and slogans begin to routinely appear at Palestine protests. The blockade snapped back on again as soon as Israel reinstated their siege of Gaza. The Trump administration decides to give its own go at bombing Gaza. The Israelis got involved, bombing Yemen. The Israelis decided to bomb Yemen as well. Again, didn't last long before they realized it's obviously not going to work. I think, unlike Iran or Lebanon, Yemen is quite homogenous and it's very remote. Very few foreigners are able to enter the Ansar Allah control part of the country. You'll see it's relatively easy to get, it's very easy to get into Lebanon, for example, as a Westerner. Iran, it's a bit harder, but still, it's not insanely difficult to get a visa. Yemen, particularly the Ansar Allah part of Yemen, it's pretty much impossible unless you have a Yemeni passport to get in there. And this, although sadly it means that we as sympathizers are unable to visit our heroes, it does mean that spies and fifth columnists weren't able to take a hold of the country. And the Yemenis are a very conservative people with little influence of pro-Western liberal ideas. So as a result of these security measures, the US and Israel, unlike in Iran, unlike in Lebanon, they didn't really have any intelligence about where to strike. And at one point, they were actually reduced to dropping bombs based on random Twitter posts by Zionist activists who claimed, we think there's a base in so-and-so location. The Yemenis have come a hell of a long way since the days of Sayyid Hussein al-Houthis activism. They created an activist base that developed into a formidable paramilitary force, faced down years of war with the Saleh dictatorship, faced down the Salafis and the Islah, the Saudi agents. They seized power, faced down years of bombing and blockade by imperialism through its proxies, and now have faced down direct intervention by the US and Israel. Yemen faces the calm before the storm. It's going through a period of relative peace now, but there can be absolutely no doubt that imperialism is planning something major against them. They're too powerful and too dangerous to be left alone. Security forces are already involved in breaking up major Mossad networks in the country. They will come under harsh attack again, that is certain, and it will be accompanied by a big propaganda campaign to demonize Ansar Allah. They'll probably say that Ansar Allah is persecuting women's rights, or they'll take advantage of Yemeni's conservative culture to push like an anti-Islam campaign, a women's rights campaign, some kind of minority group or something. At that time, it won't be trendy anymore to support Yemen. And people won't be flying Yemeni flags anymore at the protests. People won't be chanting in support of Yemen in the protests. And at that time, the genuine anti-imperialists need to remain steadfast and need to ensure that we always stand alongside Ansar Allah as long as Ansar Allah is fighting imperialism. Long live Ansar Allah, long live resistant Yemen, hands off Yemen, and I will leave it at that. I've spoken for too long already. Thank you very much.
Well done. What a phenomenal talk, comrades. Who knew we had such a public speaker in our ranks ready to give us the history of Yemen and the Ansar Allah movement. And it's really important to learn the history. I mean, it frustrates a lot of people who are eager to change things and want to do things now. And why are we learning about what happened in the 1960s? It's so long ago, so many years before many of us were born. But it's important to learn not just our history, but the history of the world. Because if we don't know history, if we don't understand history, we're giving up all the knowledge, all the vital knowledge that lets us understand why the world is the way it is and how we can change it. Imperialism wants us to live like goldfish, not remembering what happened last week, last year, 10 years ago. So they want us to think that the Yemenis are just mad. They overthrew their government and have started blowing up ships and causing all these nuisances. But there's a clear historical reality of why what's happened in Yemen has happened. And in many of these countries, you see that anti-imperialist and socialist governments and movements have been overthrown by imperialism. And that's why there's so many splits in the movements in these countries. That's why there's so many different factions. That's why there's so much chaos in these countries. And they would have us believe similarly that the conflict between Zionism and Palestine started in October 2023. But the imperialist genocidal project against the Palestinians, and against all Arabs really, has been going on since before 1948. And as Harpreet said, the Salafi Wahhabism, that's a minority branch of Sunni Islam, has been sponsored by British and American imperialism. I mean, it was the British that selected the Saudis. It was the British that selected the Hashemites to rule over Jordan. It was the imperialists that drew all the lines in the Middle East. And at first it was a reaction against Arab nationalism and a way to control the most oil-rich regions in the world. And later as a means to control any threat of imperialism, and not just in the Middle East, but across North Africa and Asia as well. We know this, like, there was a leak team, it was why Hillary was so worried about her emails getting leaked, because one of her emails said, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. You know, if that, there's no way to spell it out any more clearly than Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State saying that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, trying to overthrow the anti-imperialist government of Bashar al-Assad. So this, as you mentioned, the anti-Islamic sentiment is heavily promoted in our countries, and it took over essentially from an anti-communist propaganda, an anti-communist sentiment. As soon as it was no longer trendy in imperialist countries to be racist against Africans and Native Americans and Asians as inferior peoples, suddenly the threat was communism. And NATO was there to defend us from communism. And then they destroyed the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Bloc. And then they needed a new enemy for us to believe in and us to fight in, and that became all the Muslim nations that have been trying to be independent of imperialism or standing up to some extent or another in imperialism. and it's still heavily promoted because that's still where the major conflicts of imperialism are, and that's still where the chains of imperialism are weakest, as shown by Yemen, as shown by Palestine, as shown by Iran. That's where imperialism is weakest, that's where it's struggling most, and that's where it's getting a bloody nose. So we have to salute all those anti-imperialist forces and give that understanding to our own working class so that they understand that we have to stand with our anti-imperialist allies in those regions. Whether or not they're strictly workers' revolutions or whatever else, they are our allies and we have to fight with them. So thank you for coming, comrades. We're going to open it up to Q&A now. Any questions and answers. If you want to, come up to the front, ask your questions, make a comment. We haven't got too much time, so we'll just do a brief one, and then we might have, if we do have a little bit of time at the end, we'll have some comments on the recent Israel-Iran True Promise 3, which I'm sure everyone was following with great interest while it was going on. But if there's any questions on Burkina Faso, on Yemen and Ansar Allah, please raise your hands, come up now, don't be shy. Tim? Do you want to come up to the front, Tim?
Yeah, I just want to speak sort of into this.
Yeah.
Just want to speak very briefly because a lot can be said on this subject. That was an astounding presentation given by all our speakers here, and put it into contemporary context and the historical narrative as well. But touching upon this point that was raised about the Trotskyist organizations, these miserable cretins and modern Mensheviks and chauvinists of the chauvinists of the modern day Second International, which is what they are. They have all these negative and pessimistic views on all the forces fighting imperialism, and they mislead the working class. And until we can get rid of the degeneration of Trotskyism, and also the chauvinists of the communist parties here in this country as well, for instance, CPB, Morning Star, and all these, class liquidationist parties that call themselves communists. Until we can get rid of all of this, we're going to be fighting these bastards as well as fighting our own imperialists. But to sort of wound up, we need to be on the side. We need to fight for the defeat of our own imperialists. And, the imperialists of the NATO powers as well. Anglo-US imperialism, the imperialism of NATO. We need to fight for their defeat, and we need to be on the side of the forces that are showing an admirable, fight and battle against these imperialists. They are the DPRK, China, Syria, all the ones that have been mentioned here are the bulwark of the struggle against imperialism. And we must be on their side, giving them the support that they need. Down with imperialism. Up with the revolutionary forces that are fighting imperialism, that are on our side, and we must be on their side. Thank you, comrades. Thank you very much.
Jared?
Thank you, comrades. Regarding Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traoré, Ali, you mentioned that he's an interim president and would like to answer the question of the so-called leftists of the West and the liberals, that election would need to be held, and you mentioned that before they defeat the terrorists and stabilize the country, then they'll have. It shouldn't be a question at all. We should keep in mind that whoever asks for election at the moment means that they want the comprador elements, so they would buy out people and get them to destabilize. So the thing would be totally dictatorship. This is a dictatorship of the proletariat. So, and they would hide behind these sort of things where they would say like, oh, when the election's going to be. So that was the one point that Ibrahim Traoré hopefully would stay strong and strengthen the working class and bring them up, and hopefully Russia and China would be able to help Burkina Faso in setting up industry that they can then use to strengthen the country. We mentioned, so thank you very much, it was a brilliant presentation, and brilliant presentation on Yemen as well. One thing I would mention, sometimes when we say like Wahhabi, Salafi, all like bad, this sort of thing, there is one Wahhabi Salafi who fought really well, Yahya Sinwar.
Was he Wahhabi?
Yes, exactly. So there are those elements. So it's always the case. He's Wahhabi. He's not like. They are mostly like.
I know there's a few Wahhabi Salafis in Hamas.
Yes, exactly. So
I didn't know that he.
that's where in fact the split happened. So the Hamas that moved over to Qatar when they started the troubles in Syria. So the leadership, the political wing, they moved on to Qatar, and they split Yahya Sinwar party. They go to same mosques, same ideology, all of that, whatever. But they exactly know who is serving imperialism and who is serving the. So when we say we might just like lose some Palestinian fighters who are fighting, and they do not care about Shia, Sunnis, or Wahhabis, Salafis, or whatever. So that's one thing, that is a Sunni, hardline Sunni side of thing, but he knew exactly which side he needs to have his, make alliance with. Iran, Yemenis, PFLP, and Islamic Jihad, so they all got together and did that. So that is one point that we need to keep in mind, although the majority of them are like what Qataris are doing, or UAE, or Saudis. So just that, I wanted to bring that up. Cheers.
Thanks. I think when we're talking about any of these, any groups, any like cultural, social, religious groups, these are generalizations. And, you know, they're generalizations because it's based on what the majority is true for the majority. Like, if you talk about the role of the Protestants and the Catholics in the English Revolution, the Protestants were the revolutionary force generally in the English Revolution. In Ireland, the Catholics were the revolutionary force because that was the anti-imperialist population fighting against Protestants who were playing a reactionary role in Ireland. So all of these things depend on the context and the positioning, and you know, the real subjective conditions are determined by objective reality. And the objective reality is that you can't be you know, fighting for Palestinian independence and be reactionary imperialist at the same time. You know, it brings people into contradiction with the actual system, the actual order of things. So anyone genuinely fighting for Palestine's imperialism is going to necessarily have to be a revolutionary and against the imperialist system rather than one of the ones working for it. Dave, if you want to come back on either of those points? We're happy. Are there any more questions? Any more comments?
I'll make a small comment.
Is it about Iran?
No.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to say these were absolutely magnificent presentations, and talking about Ansarallah and how the leader could die, but the movement carried on. Our leader, Paul Braha, died this year, but with you two here, and honestly, the movement's carrying on. I'm so proud of you. So the other point I want to make, those presentations were absolutely brilliant. I'm hoping they're going to be too long for Proletarian so that we can have them in Lalkar.
Shall we have, if everyone's content with those conversations, do you want to give us a short little update on Iran?
I know probably everybody knows about Iran. We were going to have a conversation about it. Would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm sure I'm happy to. I wrote a little bit of notes.
Shall we have?
Not ready. I can start because we're bringing out Lalkar on the 1st of July, and obviously the main article is going to be on Iran. And it sort of starts by outlining.
Sorry to interrupt you. Would you like to come and sit at the front so we can listen to you properly?
Let me get my Lalkar. No Lalkar, no comment.
But we'll keep it brief.
We'll keep it brief, will we? Okay.
That's fine. I won't talk more than about 5 minutes, max.
Sorry?
I won't talk more than 5 minutes,
Yeah,
max.
brilliant.
Anything to me?
Sorry?
Do you want to
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, I can. No, I won't. Just
I'll try and speak loudly.
that's just for recording.
But what we started the article in Lalkar on was a quotation from that revolutionary organ, the Daily Telegraph. So they've got a journalist who writes quite cleverly, usually, on economic matters. And what he had to say is that Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu aims to overthrow Iran's clerical military regime and talks openly of liquidating the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This, he says, is a fight to the death. There's a very high risk that the US, Britain, and France will be drawn directly into the conflict, pitting the democracies against the coalescing confederacy of Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea, and its disturbingly large tail of semi-aligned states. The hybrid struggle between two rival blocs resembles the treacherous landscape before the 30 Years' War in 1618 and the First World War in 1914. All it takes is hubris and a few more errors to set off this slow-burning fuse and basically to start off the Third World War. And, you know, we were really on the edge, you know, because had America not pulled out pretty damn quick, it's pretty sure that Russia, China, and various other countries would have sooner or later got themselves involved. And of course, if Little Britain was busy sort of carrying American bombs to drop on Iran, then we could expect some Iranian bombs to be dropping on us. So it's very, very important. It's in that context that you need to see this whole idea that all the NATO countries are going to bump up their military expenditure to 5%. Currently it's 2% and we can't afford it. So imagine 5%, more than double of what we're already paying. And really, in Spain, I know they've already been having demonstrations against this 5% business. And the result of it, there was one sort of rather wavering voice in The Hague saying, well, I don't think we're going to be able to quite manage it. That was the Prime Minister of Spain. So we need to make ourselves felt on that. But anyway, as you know, the war started. It was all done under the aegis of, oh, we're going to stop Iran from having a nuclear bomb. And it was very reminiscent of the weapons of mass destruction that, you know, that they're imminently going to have this nuclear bomb and they've got to be stopped, they've got to be stopped. Well, first of all, even the CIA was saying there's no nuclear bomb. They're years away from doing a nuclear bomb. Everybody knew that they were years away from doing a nuclear bomb. And so this was ridiculous anyway on their own decisions. But the whole point is that they couldn't care less about that. Their object is not to stop a bomb. Their object is regime change. Instead of a government that stands up against imperialism, they want a compliant government which will follow orders and do what they're told. I was just reading earlier today a comment made by some Israeli MP to the effect that, you know, Iran's got to be like Jordan. Now, the king of Jordan, he says, we can wake him up at night and tell him to do what we want. Do we want an Iran like that? Well, anyway, there's some hope. If you know the Iranians, they won't. Apart from all else, Iran, like any other country, why should they not have a nuclear bomb? You know, they're not going to use it. Unlike Israel, Israel's got at least 90 nuclear warheads, and these were basically produced with the assistance and support of the United States. You know, everybody used to deny, oh, no, you know, this is all unofficial, no, nobody's got a nuclear, no, it's all wrong. And the Israelis themselves produced a television program showing how they developed their nuclear bombs and how they got the material from America, theoretically by theft. But it's a theft that nobody ever did anything about. So, you know, you can judge that for yourself. So anyway, the origins of this war are basically in Palestine. During the Second World War, British imperialism and French imperialism had determined that they were going to carve up between themselves the defeated Ottoman Empire. So all the Ottoman areas in the Middle East were going to be theirs. And they mobilized the masses by telling them, we're going to make you independent. So you fight with us against the Ottoman Empire, and you will get your independence at the end of the war when we win. But of course, did they get their independence? They didn't. They got little puppets hoisted on them. So theoretically, they had an independent king or whatever, but that king was a complete puppet and tool of imperialism. So in Palestine, you know, they didn't quite trust these little Arab despots. Can we trust them? Can we trust them? Better be on the safe side. And for that reason, they planted a Jewish settler colony in Palestine. Primarily, it was going to that stage to guard the Suez Canal. But basically, these were the Jewish people persuaded that there was this Zionist sect that actually they discovered somewhere in Germany or Poland or that sort of area in the middle of the 19th century, cranks who thought that God had given them Palestine. And not even Jewish people took any notice of them. They were just nonsense. But they were encouraged by imperialism because so many Jewish people, having been badly discriminated against and at the same time as being highly educated because they couldn't survive. They had no other means of living. They weren't peasants. They had to become educated in order to be able to earn a living. So these people were becoming communists. So, you know, the hope was that Zionism would attract them away from communism. You know, so this had been cultivated for 50 years. And then, ideal, let's put them a little Jewish colony settler colony of ours, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a loyal little Ulster in the midst of a sea of Arabism. So they did that. And the Zionists went in, they committed massacres to frighten the population away. They took over their homes, they took over their businesses, they took over their land, pushed them all away, and then continued to persecute them. But the Arabs at all times fought back. They weren't fighting back against people because they were Jews. They were fighting back against robbers who'd stolen their homes. The same as you and I would fight back if if the Germans had won the Second World War and were coming along and taking our homes. Well, what would we do? Put a rocket where it's needed. So this was the situation. But the trouble, from the point of view of the Arabs, they weren't just fighting the Jewish settlers. They were fighting America. They were fighting Britain. And Britain, after the Second World War, had the mandate of Palestine, and they saw to it that lots and lots of Jewish people came. Of course, the Jewish Holocaust ensured that a lot of people got frightened into coming. They told lies as well, saying that Israel was a land without people for a people without land. Once they got there, they found it was a bit different, but then it was too late. Jewish people who wanted to go to England or to America were actually refused entry and shipped into Israel instead. So, the Arabs never gave up. They kept fighting, they kept fighting, they kept fighting, they kept fighting until following the October the 7th events, the Jews said, right, or the Zionists said, it's time for the final solution, let's kill the lot in Gaza. And what's more, they got the backing of America, they got the backing of Britain. And any of us who was going around saying, well, this is a genocide, we'd find ourselves in the police station being questioned and large coppers coming into the house and rummaging through everything to look at, to prove that you're a terrorist and all the rest of it. So there was huge discrimination against people who stated the obvious, actually, so when the Zionists invaded Gaza and subjected it to carpet bombing and a horrific incursion, well, guess what? They thought they were going to finish them off in 6 weeks at most, but they couldn't finish them off. They still haven't finished them off. Even with hardly any food to eat, the resistance is still fighting back. It's still managing to bump people off. It's still pushing them back. They can't get rid of them. They can't stop the resistance. And therefore, at the same time, this is costing Israel. It's we've seen how the Yemenis have stopped their shipping, made their shipping company bankrupt, or their port bankrupt. The cost is absolutely gigantic. Their soldiers are going to Gaza, coming back injured or with PTSD and unable to fight. The population is running away. Their economic activity has sort of largely ground to a halt because it's a wartime condition. So, what can we do? So Netanyahu's attempt all along was to bring in America. Let America come and fight for us because, it's okay, we're very grateful for the help we get, but actually we need America physically to join the war. And hence the attack on Iran. That was the one thing that they thought. Netanyahu knew, and he'd actually warned the Israelis that there would be repercussions as a result of the assault on Iran. So, but he calculated that America would be bound to come in, even though it probably disapproved, it would come in to save its little aircraft carrier, Israel. And that's sort of what it did. But first of all, the Iranian bombing was far greater than anything that had been imagined by Israel. The damage to Tehran was spectacular. Important buildings were damaged. In the course of bombing military installations, One hospital, which was located rather close to a military installation, was damaged by the blast. Iran made it clear we didn't target the hospital, we targeted the military installation next door, and as a result of the blast, the hospital was damaged. Nobody was killed, and I think that is evidence of the fact that they definitely didn't target the hospital. The Iron Dome failed completely. Why did it fail? Because there was just too many rockets coming all at once. I mean, this had already been demonstrated earlier that this is the way to overcome the Iron Dome. But this time, they had another little trick, which there's some speculation as to how they managed it, but they used drones to persuade the missiles of the Iron Dome to attack the Israeli missiles. So this was rather fine. They were blowing up their own ordnance. Very great stuff. So anyway, in comes Trump saying, yes, all right, well, I'm going to blow up Fort O. I'm going to bring these big bombs and bunker busters. Only American bunker busters will do the job. Well, American bunker busters couldn't do the job. As the Iranians have said, these nuclear facilities are buried deep enough to withstand a nuclear attack. They're going to manage the American bunker busters. So we allowed ourselves a little joke and said, well, of course, the Americans have dropped a bunker buster on their own foot. In retaliation, the Iranians bombed 3 American military bases in the Middle East, exactly as they said they would. And straight away, Trump was saying, peace, 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 ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. And after some fits and starts, a sort of ceasefire is what we've got. You know, there's a lot of boasts on the part of America that they've destroyed the nuclear buildings. But in a way that, even if they had, I doubt whether they've done very much damage at all, but even if they had, that really isn't the point. They've actually succeeded in mobilizing the entire Iranian population, including those people who are criticizing the government. They've mobilized them to act as one against imperialism. They've driven the nuclear bomb, the nuclear development, which was entirely for peaceful purposes, but it's now been driven underground, and there won't be any more inspectors coming along and telling the Americans exactly what's happening. So they really have dropped a bomb on their own foot. But even if this ceasefire holds, the point to remember is it's not over. There's not a single problem that's been resolved, and it's only a matter of time before we're back under the threat of the Third World War breaking out yet again. We must redouble our efforts to mobilize the masses so that they won't allow a war. If we can't stop a war, then we're going to suffer very badly as a result of it, although it will lead to socialism in the end.
Thanks, Ella. Hopper?
Yeah, So I'm not going to go over the history of the conflict that's just happened because Comrade Ella has just done a marvellous job of it. But the main thing that I wanted to mention is it made a very nice change to see the Western left come out overwhelmingly supporting Iran's right to self-defense during this war, to the point where in the very recent Palestine protests, we've actually seen the protests, I think was last weekend, there was actually a lot of Iranian flags. And it was a nice thing to see. I think even the RCP people are coming out and saying Iran is fighting in self-defense, which is incredible. Even they're admitting it. So this is really good to see. But it's just I'm just a little bit cynical personally because it's just I just bear in mind that most of these leftists only 3 years earlier they were absolutely demanding regime change in Iran, when there was a colour revolution in 2022 and foreign-backed rioters were going around lynching supporters of the Iranian government, and virtually all these socialists and anti-imperialists were claiming there was some kind of women's uprising going on. In a country where women work as doctors, as engineers, they have women vice presidents. I genuinely think it's probably one of the most progressive countries for women in the Middle East in terms of the positions that they reached, regardless of whatever attitudes certain clerics and scholars might hold personally. But yeah, and I have absolutely no doubt that the majority of these self-styled socialists will quite quickly go back to calling for regime change in Iran and forget that yesterday they were talking about Iran's right to self-defense, and definitely they'll say, even now we've seen a lot of them, they sort of justify everything they say by saying, but I'm not a supporter of the regime, I'm not a supporter of the mullahs, but X, Y, Z. And honestly, if you say I'm not a supporter of the Islamic regime, I'm not a supporter of the mullahs, like, what does that even mean? Because the mullahs can mean a lot of different people. There's a lot of mullahs in Iran with various different positions. When you say you're against the mullahs, you mean you're against the neoliberal elements in the government who've consistently promoted Gorbachev-style ideas about peace with US imperialism, then maybe we could agree that maybe we don't like those elements. But I don't think that's who they're referring to when they say they don't like the mullahs. If they're referring to men like Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei and the late Sayyid Ibrahim Raisi and their so-called associates, men who've spent their whole lives in revolutionary national liberation work, suffering years of torture and imprisonment in the dungeons of the Shah, who sacrificed their country's wealth and security to help and train and arm the Palestinian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, the Yemeni resistance for decades, who sacrificed hundreds of their own sons to defend Syria from imperialist attack. If you say that you're an anti-imperialist, and then you qualify that by saying, but I'm against that regime, I don't think you're a real anti-imperialist, to be honest. Regardless of what your position is about Islam or whatever, I don't think you're a real anti-imperialist. You can't be a real anti-imperialist and say I'm against those mullahs. Make no mistake, comrades, if the Iranian regime falls, it's not possible to replace the Iranian regime and still keep a regime that supports Palestine. Just like it wasn't possible to get rid of the brutal dictatorship of Assad, but still keep a progressive secular Syria that supports Palestine. That wasn't possible. And just as it wasn't possible to get rid of Gaddafi's brutal dictatorship and still keep an independent Libya that hasn't fallen apart, that wasn't possible either. In the exact same way, it is not possible, whatever the trots say, it's not possible to get rid of the Iranian regime without completely screwing over the Palestine movement. And if the Iranian regime, if the Iranian government falls, if the Islamic Republic of Iran falls, make no mistake, comrades, it will be the biggest blow to the free peoples of the world since the fall of the USSR, and it will be a very dark day for Palestine. I won't say it will be the end of the Palestinian cause, because I don't think anything could end the Palestinian cause, but it will set it back decades, because the Iranian regime is the number one supporter, virtually the sole supporter of the Palestinian cause. And the way that they've essentially thrown their own national interests under the bus for the sake of Palestine is the sort of revolutionary internationalism. Sure, they might not be socialists, but it's sort of revolutionary internationalism that we haven't really seen since the days of the USSR. And it's something that every serious anti-imperialist has to admire. And as I said, if the Islamic Republic of Iran falls, the future of the Middle East will have an Israeli flag flying over it for many decades to come. And I don't know about you, but I certainly don't want to see that happen. Thank you so much. Long live the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hands off Iran.
Thank you both, Harpreet and Ella, for that talk on Iran. And I think you're wrong when you say Iran's sacrificing its own national interests for the Palestinians. I think being drawn into this imperialist conflict is helping Iran realise its own interests. is exposing the compradors within Iran as useless traitors to the Iranian and the wider working class, because there can be no peace with imperialism. Just as the Iranians have to realise there is only the class struggle internationally, British workers have to realise there is only the class struggle in this country. And I think that's been made obvious, even more obvious by the Home Secretary saying she wants to ban Palestine Action as terrorists, when they sprayed some jets down that were being used to refuel, I believe, transport supplies to Israel or refuel Israeli jets. I think it was transporting supplies, actually. But it turns out these aren't even owned. That was the argument used on GB News, another mouthpiece of the reactionary class. It said on GB News, the taxpayers can have to foot the bill for these. Why? Yeah. These are privately owned jets. There's a series of shell companies where these jets are privately owned, and I think Lockheed Martin sits as a majority, or another defence contractor, defence company, sits as the major shareholder of these RAF jets, which are privately owned. And it just shows why the imperialists are now pushing this 5% idea in NATO. It's because they desperately need a world war in order to escape the constant economic crises that we find ourselves in. They desperately need a war. It's not a question of, can we afford a war? They can't afford not to have a war. It's not a question of spending on welfare or the NHS. They can't afford to do that with or without a war. They need these wars in order to prop up their dying economic system, to give life to it. They had the little boost from the destruction of the socialist bloc. They've been going after little targets like Libya, like Syria, like Yugoslavia, that have nourished them by destroying things, by using up material, and by destroying companies, by cracking open new markets, employing new sources of labour. But these wells are drying up, and they know it. And the massive transfer of wealth from all of the poorest working class in the imperialist nations to the richest is not a coincidence. It's because the system is grinding to a halt. And when the next big crash comes, I guarantee that is when the next phase of World War III will open up. But they want to prepare for it because they've been shown that they're paper tigers. They want these little tests with Iran to see how their air defences work, to see if they can hit targets on the ground, to see how their fighter jets perform, how their missiles and bombs perform. But they've been shown up in Ukraine, and they've been sending all the material to Ukraine, and they're still losing. They've been shown up against Iran. They've been shown up against Yemen. They've been shown that precisely because they've exported all their capital, and Russia, China, and other nations have become the manufacturing centres of the world. These are now the technological centres of the world, because it goes hand in hand with industry. They're building things there. They're doing things. Britain doesn't even have its own nuclear weapons. They're American. Britain can't build its own nuclear reactors. They have to ask the French and Chinese. So all of Starmer's blustering and nonsense about rebuilding the army, it shows that all of that is based on a sea of nothing. Furthermore, they need to rely on technological superiority, which they no longer have, because the population cannot be brought behind another world war. That may change if war does break out and people start being more propagandized and compelled to join. Jingoism, patriotism goes up at the announcement of every war. But as it stands, the majority of the British population say they don't want to, especially the younger people, say they would not fight for this country in a war, because this country isn't offering them anything. This country can't provide them anything under the current economic system. So it's the most patriotic duty for us and the most internationalist duty for us to fight against these wars, to fight against NATO, to remove NATO from our country and to remove Britain from NATO. That is the principal task of anti-imperialists in this country. And if you agree with that aim, I'd urge you, if you're not a supporter or a member, subscribe to our papers. They contain excellent analysis about what's going on in the world, what's really going on in the world, and how we can change it. Subscribe to our papers, sign up as a supporter, get involved, come to our study classes to learn where this analysis comes from, get involved to come out on the streets to bring this analysis to workers, and to support all these important causes, from Palestine to the NHS. These issues are all linked. And it's our party that needs to become the tribune of the people and link them up in people's understanding and bring it to the working class. Otherwise, it really will be socialism or barbarism. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you.